best blue wool dress, pinned her down to oil her curly hair, and took her up the mountain to be eaten by a dragon. Horse. They didn't say, "Guess what's going to happen to you today?" or "Bad news about that tree climbing expedition you had planned for tomorrow." They didn't say much beyond, "Stop wiggling," and "Don't you dare bite me." If they had told her she was off to be a dragon's breakfast, she might have pointed out that the dragon certainly wouldn't care what her hair looked like, so there was no need to spend the last minutes of her life torturing her. But instead, she thought she was trapped on another boring walk with the dragonmancers for an edifying lecture about dragon behavior. And so all she wondered, as they marched through the woods, was why her parents were holding her hands so tightly, and why none of the other village children had been dragged along. She was too young to remember the apprentice who'd been sacrificed 5 years earlier, especially since it was forbidden to talk about the gifts the village gave the dragons. And despite what the dragonmancers thought, Wren hadn't fully understood what she'd read in the books she stole from them. Wren did notice the strange sideways looks from the other villagers, but it did not occur to her that those were "good thing it's her getting fed to a dragon and not me" kinds of looks. She thought they were the usual "there goes Wren, the girl with a dragon's temper" faces she always got. She liked making a horrible face back, so she could see them blanch and turn away quickly. But really, she should have been more suspicious. She should have realized her parents were being too quiet. It's just, one never really expects to be fed to dragons. And then suddenly, one dragonmancer stopped and raised his hands, and then all the villagers stopped and stared at Wren. The other two dragonmancers produced ropes from their robes and grabbed her. The tall, thin one said something like, "Hear us, O mighty wings of flame," in her snooty voice, and the short one, with bumps all over his face, said, "We offer you this gift, that you may spare the rest of your lonely worshippers." Then the leader, the smug one, who always ate all the goat cheese at village celebrations, started to say, "Thank you for the lives of those," but Wren didn't let him finish. She recognized the words they were chanting. She'd read them in one of the books she'd borrowed from the head dragonmancer's study. This was the Gift for the Dragons ceremony. It was real after all, and this time she was the gift. After a lot of wrestling and screaming and fighting, they finally managed to tie her up. But they didn't get to say all their stupid blessing words. One dragonmancer staggered away with his nose bleeding. Another clutched her scratched-up arm. The third was hobbling as they hurried off. Wren shouted every bad word she knew at them as the villagers scurried away, avoiding her eyes. Her parents didn't even look back once. They left her on a giant stone slab overlooking the river, where the sky was wide open and the dragons would be able to see her easily. The idea, of course, was that the 7-year-old would sit there politely and wait to be eaten, like a good little human sacrifice. But that was obviously not going to happen. Although she was quite little, Wren was never polite and rarely good. And Wren was very much not on board with a plan where she got eaten and all the smug-faced meanies in her village did not. That was the ultimate definition of unfair. Wren was a younger sister, so she knew all about fair and unfair, and getting eaten by dragons while jerks like Camellia stayed inside, probably playing with Wren's dolls, was absolutely 100% not fair. Wren had one brother who'd agree with her, she was pretty sure, but her uncle had taken leave hunting this morning. To get him out of the way, she realized now. Not that an 8-year-old could have stopped the village's plan either, but at least he could have been super mad. He would have yelled at Mom and Dad. He would have been full of rage and vengeance forever, and made their lives miserable for all time, and they would have totally deserved it. But instead, she knew they'd tell him there was a sad accident while he was gone, and little Wren got chomped by a dragon, Too bad. And he'd be sad, but then he'd get over it, and everyone would la-dee-da off into their peaceful, Wrenless futures. Moons above, Wren thought furiously, as she wriggled her hands free from the ropes. They'll probably tell him it was my fault, that I was disobedient again, and that's why I got gobbled. They're going to make me into a story they tell other kids to make them behave. Now she was really mad. She yanked off the rope around her ankles and jumped to her feet. What she wanted to do most was run after the villagers and Dragonmancers and yell at them some more. She wanted them to know they were unfair, stupid heads, and that she absolutely refused to get eaten by a dragon, and she didn't even care if a dragon came and ate everybody else because they were all mean. Wren took 2 steps into the forest and stopped herself. If I run after them, they'll just tie me up again, but tighter. They wouldn't listen to her. They never did. The more she yelled and screamed, the less they listened. This was a fact she had noticed, but it only made her want to scream louder. Screaming right now would probably summon a dragon, though. Or the Dragonmancers, with their cold fingers and scowling faces. Of those 2 options, Wren might prefer the dragon. She slid down the muddy bank and crouched beside the river, trailing her hands in the ice-cold water. Droplets flew up around her wrists, catching in the sunlight like diamonds tossed into the air. It isn't fair, she thought, yanking a weed up from between the river pebbles. Why did they pick me? Out of everyone in the village, why did the dragons send a vision saying they wanted to eat me? I bet they didn't, Wren cried. I bet the dragons don't even care. She plucked a rock from the riverbed and threw it at a bush on the opposite bank. They'd eat anyone they found all tied up. If they could choose, they'd pick someone bigger and yummier than me. Like Camellia. She would make a much better sacrifice to the dragons. Why didn't they pick her? Everyone was always saying how sweet Wren's next oldest sister was. She'd be so oily and sugary, the dragons could choke on her. But the Dragonmancers loved Camellia, and the way she listened to them with her eyes wide and her fake, "This is so fascinating," face on. Wren stared into the rippling water. The Dragonmancers would never choose Camellia, she said out loud. They chose me because they don't like me, and Mother and Father let them. Of course the Dragonmancers chose the loud 7-year-old who kicked Master Trout in the shins when he scolded her, the girl who stole their books and read all their secrets, even if she only half understood them. They'd be happy to get rid of her. And maybe Mother and Father were too. Nobody tried to stop them at all. Not one stupid person in the whole village. She knew her parents were terrified of dragons and did everything the Dragonmancers said all the time. But she still would have thought they might say, "Could you double-check that vision one more time? Are you sure it's our daughter the dragons want?" Wren rubbed her eyes angrily. "Stop crying. So people are terrible and can't be trusted. That shouldn't be such a big surprise, Wren. They've never stood up for you before. Nobody cares about you, and so you shouldn't care about them either." Well, I think I shall not get eaten, she thought. That will show them. I don't need a village, or parents, or any of them. I'm smarter than all of them, and smarter than the dragons, too. I don't have to be someone's breakfast if I decide not to be, so there. But that meant she couldn't go home. She could never go back to Talisman now that the Dragonmancers had told everyone her destiny was to be dragon food, and her parents had said, "Sure, that sounds right. Fine by us." She stood up, shaking the freezing droplets off her hand, and a flicker of motion caught her eye on the opposite riverbank. Instantly she crouched, her heart bursting into a gallop and screaming, "Dragon!" even as her mind registered that the animal, whatever it was, couldn't be much bigger than a rabbit. She took a deep breath. "It's something little. Maybe my breakfast. She kept her eye on the spot where she'd seen it, but the movement had stopped. Cautiously, she slipped into the cold river and splashed across. The other side was rockier, covered in glassy black stones and small tangles of little leafless shrubs. The thing she'd seen was caught in one of those nets of branches that leaned out over the river. She crept toward it slowly. A rabbit would be great. Breathe, Wren. Don't panic. It's certainly not a dragon. It was a dragon. Or at least, it was a very small, pathetic, skinny miniature of a dragon. Its scales were the palest orange she'd ever seen, like a sunset painted on wool and then left under a waterfall, or out in the sunlight for too long. She'd never seen a dragon so pale before. All the ones in the mountains